One of Nintendo's most significant new IPs of the Nintendo Switch era was not even on the Nintendo Switch itself, but it was 2018's Dragalia Lost, the mobile action RPG. I will say up front that I never personally played the game, but I have to say I do find it fascinating. Where did this series come from? Why did it disappear? And will it return again, perhaps even on the Switch 2? What about the developers Cygames and their closer than usual partnership with Nintendo, which saw the House of Mario buying a 5% stake in the Dragalia devs? Is there more to come on that front? So please like, subscribe and settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive into Nintendo's partnership with Cygames and their joint project Dragalia Lost. Let's wind back to the 27th of April 2018. On this date, Nintendo's then president, Tatsumi Kimishima, announced a business agreement with Cygames to partner on a new gaming application, singular, for smart devices. The game, as you've probably surmised, was Nintendo's mobile exclusive original IP, Dragalia Lost, which released on the App Store and Google Play in September of 2018. I think it's worth paying close attention to the wording of the announcement here. They said, the gaming application will be released globally, starting with Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau. With the support of Nintendo's group companies, it will launch in North America and Europe as well. For the purpose of facilitating the partnership, Nintendo will obtain approximately 5% of Cygames issued stocks, mainly through a third-party allocation of its treasury stock. Okay, so there's a lot to unpick here. Firstly, note the significance of international distribution. The scale of Dragalia Lost appears to be quite large, and so translation and localization costs alone would have been very significant, let alone the fact that Cygames was Japan-based and lacked Nintendo's international nous at that time. This gives us an idea of one driver of the original deal, although it's much more complex than that, as we will soon uncover. Let's also review the nature of the buyout, a third-party allocation of its, Cygames, treasury stocks. Treasury stocks are stocks that the company has bought back themselves. The idea is that they can be sold on later. In this case, Nintendo didn't go in specifically to buy Cygames shares on the open market, but they struck a deal with Cygames whereby approximately 5% of its shares that were previously held back by the company were then purchased by Nintendo. This is an effective way to raise capital, but ever since it has raised the question, is Dragalia it for the Nintendo-Cygames partnership? After all, Nintendo has some history of incrementally larger stakes in game developers. Note its progressive absorption of Monolith Soft and even Nintendo Cube, which started as a collaboration with Dentsu. Still, I think Cygames is a slightly different case. Cygames is actually a subsidiary of a larger firm called CyberAgent. Established in 1998 in Tokyo, in 2000 it went public on the Tokyo Stock Exchange for so-called Mother's Market. Mother is an acronym for Market of the High Growth and Emerging Stocks. In a quarter century, its history has been of continual growth. The company has become highly diversified, and Cygames was not even their first toe in the pond of video games. They also established SumZap Inc. in 2009, though 2011 Cygames launch was to be far more successful for them. However, in 2012, Cygames received a 24% investment from DNA, the mobile tech giant who jointly with Nintendo created Nintendo Systems. The joint statement from Cygames and DNA stated that their aim was to strengthen their existing relationship by promoting further fusion of Cygames' creativity and DNA's proven expertise in social game development and operation. Cygames moved into the console space in 2015 and established an anime studio in 2016. They are now increasingly publishing games by other developers, such as the Granblue Fantasy Versus series by Arc System Works, famous to Nintendo fans perhaps as the Another Code Recollection devs. In this context, the company appears to be highly diversified and connected to a much larger corporation in the form of CyberAgent. So let's understand how Nintendo and Cygames came to be partnered in the first place. In an interview with GNN, Cygames' Hiroki Matsuura recounts the origins of the collaboration, saying, "When Watanabe, the representative of the company, had a meeting with Nintendo before, he talked about the topic of, if we can do something together, it will be very good, which became an opportunity for this cooperation. After countless discussions and communications, it was decided to jointly develop the action RPG Dragalia Lost, which includes the strengths of both sides." Tatsumi Kimishima has a similar recollection, specifically that the application was initiated by Cygames themselves. He stated to investors, "We felt that the application being designed by Cygames called Dragalia Lost is interesting and that it aligned well with Nintendo's concept, so we forged the business partnership with Cygames on the idea that it would enhance our own development resources for smart device applications going forward. At the time, they wanted to make smart device businesses a key pillar of their revenue, and they knew that they would not be able to rely purely on in-house development. We have seen other examples of their external partnerships bearing fruit, of course, such as Niantic's work on Pikmin Bloom after they initially developed Pokemon Go. Cygames' Hiroki Matsuura himself seems to have been key to their collaboration as well, however. In a Famitsu interview translated by Nintendo Everything, Matsuura recounted, "I originally worked at the Nintendo subsidiary Brownie Brown, now 1UP Studios, and it's a great nostalgic feeling to be working with Nintendo again." Nintendo's Hideki Kono appears to have been overseeing. Kono became famous in Nintendo circles as the director of Mario Kart 64, and the original Yoshi's Island, but more recently has been the producer overseeing both Nintendo's mobile games and also keeping a weather eye on Mario Kart as a producer, though the core development of that series day to day appears to be under the direction of ARMS creator Kosuke Yabuki now. Nintendo usually lets its most senior people do the media rounds, with some exceptions such as the developer interviews on their websites, where they occasionally show a little more behind the curtain. Of the collaborative process, Matsuura recounts, "Obviously we had a lot of meetings online, but we were also travelling to and from Tokyo and Kyoto to have private meetings too. Before the official release, the game was being kept completely secret. Between Nintendo and our company, there were many in management who were surprised at our collaboration, but I think the people most surprised were those that had no idea it was happening." Typical Nintendo to focus on surprise and delight. Dragalia Lost was a huge project with seemingly scores of voice actors, enough music to spin off an EP and an album, plus there were reportedly over 600,000 words in the original story. That's about 4 times Lord of the Rings, or in game terms, 10 Final Fantasy VIIs. However, Matsuura stepped down as the game's director in 2019, superseded by Yuji Okada of Blaze Games. Matsuura's statement was as follows: "I've been responsible for Dragalia Lost from planning up through development and then through its first 10 months after release. It's thanks to all of you who play the game that we've come as far as we have. I am deeply grateful to all of you for playing. It is a bit sad to be leaving the project, but Mr. Okada has a wealth of experience developing and managing games, including social games. He assisted in the final stages of development for Dragalia Lost, so I have no worries about leaving this game in his hands. I believe that Mr. Okada's fresh perspective will allow him to expand the game both in terms of story as well as game systems. I'm as excited as anyone to see where he takes it. Dragalia Lost is only going to keep getting bigger, so I hope you'll continue to support the game." Okada himself simply stated, "Hello, I'm Yuji Okada from Blaze Games, and Cygames has invited me to take over as director for Dragalia Lost. I've been involved with the game since before it's released, but now I'll be taking the reins from Mr. Matsuura. I want to continue creating for and managing it in a way that brings even more joy to you, the players, so I hope for your continued support." What I find curious is that neither developer gave any real context to the decision, and while it would not be surprising for a more senior developer like Matsuura to step away for further development responsibilities, there are a multitude of other possibilities. Note also that Okada says that he was invited by Cygames to take over the game, no mention of Nintendo. Perhaps this isn't too significant in itself, but the lack of any reference in a fairly major shift for Nintendo may suggest that it was more a Cygames concern than a Nintendo one by this point. We should also observe that there's no indication that the game is going anywhere. Matsuura talks about the game only getting bigger and better, and while he couldn't exactly say anything else for fear of talking down the project, the indication is that the title is still aiming to expand significantly. Nevertheless, Nintendo does have some form with cutting the legs of major development of their online-focused series after about 10 months. Super Mario Maker 2 had a similar time frame, and while Animal Crossing New Horizon and Splatoon 2 pushed closer to the 2-year mark for significant support, those were remarkably successful in a way that Dragalia Lost appears not to have been. My hunch is that even if Dragalia were inordinately successful, if Matsuura was the key link for Nintendo, the key creative driving force, Nintendo may have decided after a couple of years to pull support to try to direct the partnership in other directions, as has been their approach in other fields. Whether they had a hand in the changeover is unclear, and it may not be anything to do with Nintendo having further designs for Matsuura's development efforts. If Nintendo scaled back investment at this point, Cygames may have felt that Okada was simply a cheaper option, for example. At any rate, in August 2022, it was announced that the game would be discontinued as of the end of November 2022, and since then it has been radio silence for Dragalia. So the question is, what is next for the franchise? First of all, it appears to have been modestly successful for the companies. It lasted 4 years, and reportedly it generated $16 million in revenue for the first 2 weeks on the market, though given the presumably very high production costs, it is possible that the actual final profits were more modest. Shantaro Furukawa commented that the momentum of Dragalia Lost was steady rather than strong compared to right after its release, a turn of phrase which strikes me as damning with faint praise. He elucidated that daily active users are stable and ardent fans continue to play it, not only in Japan, but other regions as well. So basically, while it had a good enough start, it wasn't continuing to grow and was mainly appealing to its core audience. And as Nintendo pivoted away from a mobile strategy, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't be as fussed about supporting the game long term. Furukawa also noted, "We are presently introducing improvements to make the game more enjoyable and keep people playing." No reference to bringing new people on board. He explained that design changes were introduced after feedback following the game's launch. The game has a 69 on Metacritic but did win Portable Game of the Year during the 22nd Annual DICE Awards. While Animal Crossing Pocket Camp wrapped up by offering a for-purchase version of the game for people to play in perpetuity, Nintendo's previous mobile games did not offer the same, and it seems plausible that this decision was taken to potentially head off future legislative changes that some are campaigning for, notably in the European Union, with regard to allowing continuing access to mobile games after active support ends. It also seems like a low-cost way of monetizing a game that they have spent a lot of time developing. In the case of Animal Crossing and Mario Kart, there is a history of the developers cross-pollinating with the mobile titles, most obviously demonstrated with the Mario Kart Tour tracks being heavily cannibalized into the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass. However, it's harder to see where the points of intersection are with Nintendo's core development team and Cygames, not least because of the lack of credits given for the developers on the smartphone title. While Nintendo shared the ending credits of the game, these appear to be for the voice actors and the music rather than the development team, and while many EPD collaborations have had heavy input from Japan, note how Next Level Games and Retro Studios interviewees always speak of regular and detailed contributions from Japan, it's not as clear that there are particularly passionate individuals at Nintendo who might drive the series with the key movement done by Cygames. On the other hand, the core mechanics that underpin Dragalia do appear to be Nintendo's, and in fact, they filed an infringement lawsuit against the developer of the mobile game Shironiko Project in December 2017 for violating patents, including one which links to touchscreen joystick controls, which some people say resembles the kind of controls used in Dragalia. It was settled in 2021, with the developers agreeing a 3.3 billion yen payout to Nintendo. While Nintendo will always be assiduous in protecting its patents, their imminent plans to use this in a smartphone app may also have concentrated their minds. It also makes sense of Tatsumi Kimishima's comment that Dragalia aligned well with Nintendo's concept. Nintendo very rarely starts with design elements and works back to gameplay. They like to have a strong mechanic at the core. This suggests to me that they had a strong mechanic they wanted to implement for smartphones, but they didn't necessarily know how that would be enacted. It therefore seems likely that while games like Splatoon, Animal Crossing, and even Metroid and Luigi's Mansion were heavily designed in the heart of Nintendo, that Dragalia lost surface elements, its story and its looks may well have rested far more on the Cygames team to develop. That said, I think the status of Nintendo's funding into Cygames specifically might not be too significant. Nintendo made a stock investment, but it appears that this was more an elegant way for Nintendo to provide fundings, a way that gave them a little more leverage to continue a partnership they hoped would prove profitable in the long term if their smart device strategy took off, but not one which limited them by forcing a future collaboration. They took a similar and in fact much larger investment in the Pux Corporation, who collaborated with them on the development of Wii Fit Plus for Wii U, but there's no evidence of further collaboration on that front either. So, what is next for Dragalia? Nintendo likes to sweat its assets. The fact that even niche titles like Another Code have found rehabilitation on Switch shows that it is possible that we could see Dragalia again, but there are limiting factors. As I've covered in a video last year, Another Code seems to owe its revival in part due to the original developers expressing an interest, and we know that Nintendo likes to deepen its relationship with specific creators. Therefore, it really comes back to Hiroki Matsuura. The man appears to be working at Cygames still, with a 2022 directing credit and a 2024 special thanks credit at the company, so this is not a case as with Grezzo or Mercury Steam, where a developer relationship rolled straight from one game to the next. On the other hand, both Grezzo and Mercury Steam worked on their own independent projects as a company alongside Nintendo ones, so we can't completely rule out that since 2022 at least, Matsuura and Nintendo have been looking at a different project together. We're getting highly speculative here, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Nintendo like their long development times and will only move on something when they are ready, but either something with Dragalia or a new project do remain possibilities. The difficulty with forecasting this is that there are so many unknowns. Given how few mobile games offer credits, we are entirely reliant on public interviews to even know if he is involved. The baseline likelihood surely has to be that he's working on a project that isn't linked to Nintendo, but we know from Shuntaro Furukawa's recent Q&A that Nintendo is continuing to pursue smartphone apps as one strand of its business, and so it would make sense to do so with a known and trusted collaborator. If this is the case though, would Dragalia be the best choice to develop? After all, if Nintendo forged this partnership for Matsuura's mobile expertise, then the next logical step would be to develop a different smartphone app. And there is a smartphone app that is curious by its absence from Nintendo's lineup, but which could be very big for them indeed. Specifically, The Legend of Zelda. Obviously, Dragalia is a very different style of action RPG, but it seems like the developer of that game might be seen as a good prospect to develop a long-awaited Zelda mobile app. This is also something that Nintendo would be incredibly cautious about doing, especially after Super Mario Run's seeming failure, but then again, they are now using the apps less as a source of profit in their own right, but rather as ways to expose more people to their IPs and drive people to their core business. In this case, with a Zelda film targeting release sometime this decade, there is the potential for a Zelda app to be a core part of that franchise's expansion strategy. Given that Zelda is the most major of the Nintendo franchises not to yet have a smart device app, it seems that a Zelda app by the end of 2027 would have to be plausible, but set against this the low release rate of smartphone apps from Nintendo, and let's say there would be a 30% chance of it happening. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that either Matsuura or Cygames, or even both, would be involved. What about Dragalia then? There are logistical issues here too. Nintendo does like to push its IPs even when they don't seem to have hugely impressive sales numbers. Look at the effort they've put into Pikmin and Metroid in the Switch era. But these were internally developed in EPD, or at least started that way, whereas Dragalia seems to be closer to games like Another Code or Endless Ocean, which were developed with third parties taking the lead, and it's possible that Nintendo will feel less attachment to the franchise, especially if their core contribution was the smart device specific functionality and gameplay, which they may be less concerned about implementing on Switch or Switch 2, meaning that the franchise would remain on mobile unless Cygames decided to take the development on themselves. There is some precedent for previous Nintendo collaborations ending up as third-party only titles on the Switch as well. See Wonderful 101 and Fatal Frame Maiden of Blackwater, which were Wii U Nintendo collaborations, but ended up independently released after Nintendo seemingly lost interest in the franchises. There's also the case of Endless Ocean Luminous, which Nintendo published, but seemed to have very little to do with developing. Also, while console generations provide a ready opportunity to remount games for each new generation, smartphones don't really have generational leaps in the same way, and it's difficult to see that a second Dragalia app would be especially more likely to outperform the first. Now, that's not to say that Dragalia is doomed. Given the huge investment that was made in it, it seems like some kind of console re-release would be a low-hanging fruit. Cygames are developing the consoles, and Nintendo could easily transition it over. The question is whether the gameplay will be sufficient as it stands to make an impressive console release. Nintendo are cautious about quality, and it may be that redeveloping the game for consoles is too major an effort to be worth it to them at this point. It's the sort of thing that might make for a good Nintendo Switch Online bonus at some stage. Nintendo Music showed that they are happy for the online service to expand into smartphone apps, and so in theory, having a ready-made smartphone app game to download could make an interesting side offer for them. So let's look at the options. If Matsuura is working with Nintendo still, it's unlikely that they would be as bothered about Dragalia as what he could do for a new and different app. On the other hand, as long as that relationship exists, and while Matsuura still has a passion for this major project of his, it also seems quite likely that Dragalia will eventually return, and it's quite possible that a console Dragalia could be a side project alongside something else he is developing. Nintendo's usual approaches with franchises is to rely on repurposing old content out of the gate before moving on to anything new. Even 2D Metroid and 2D Zelda in recent years started their returns with remakes, such as Link's Awakening and Samus Returns, before their developers were tasked with anything new. Therefore, I think an all-new Dragalia by the end of, let's say, 2027 is a 10% chance, but I think the chances of a reiteration on the mobile version seems a little more likely. I don't necessarily think that Nintendo will need to keep the link with Cygames, but given that they like to do work with the same partners and they have less of a footprint in the mobile game space, it would make sense for them to do so. They revived the Niantic partnership 6 years after Pokemon Go with Pikmin Bloom, and notably for a similar kind of app, a fitness game with a Pikmin theming, whereas Pokemon Go was a fitness game with a Pokemon theming. I think the potential for them to try again with Cygames, but with a different focus, has to be high given the outsized success of Fire Emblem Heroes. I'd say there's a 50% chance that a new Cygames partnership with Nintendo is announced by the end of 2027, and as for what that could be, The Legend of Zelda seems like the most obvious choice, but Nintendo does have a deep library. Golden Sun might be a left-field option for them, although, as with Dragalia, the fact that the core movement on the development team was from Camelot rather than Nintendo's internal development units may limit their interest in exploring that franchise to its fullest extent. For more on Nintendo's online strategy, do check out the videos on screen, but meantime, thank you for watching, liking, commenting, sharing and subscribing. Thanks to the Patreon community of the channel, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.